Good evening. Welcome to the Walker Art Center. My name is Andrew Blauvelt. I'm the design director and curator of architecture and design. Thank you for coming out this evening. I'd like to thank our sponsor, which is Target, for making Thursday night gallery admission and the events on Thursday night free, including this event, this Drawn Here lecture series. Drawn Here was originally conceived as a lecture series focusing on architecture and design in the state of Minnesota, but we've expanded that over the course of a few years to include architects we're bringing in from around the world, actually, and tonight's lecture is no exception. I do want to make to point out that on April 24th, we'll have a panel discussion that's very close to home, which is about the development, quote unquote, of suburbia around the Twin Cities and different Twin City suburbs. That will be part of a panel discussion called Next Exit, the Shifting Landscape of Suburbia, and there's a description in the program guide that you have. So I'll call your attention to that. And then after we were webcasting live, we've discovered we have a big online audience as well from around the world. And in order to have them understand any questions, we'll do a Q&A at the end of the talk, a brief one. And if we could get your questions on the microphone, so there'll be some ushers that have microphones. So if you could kind of wait a few seconds for them to get to you with the microphone, then we can record the questions so that the answer will make some kind of sense to the audience online. So without further ado, I'm very particularly pleased to have with us this evening Sean Griffiths of FAT, Fashion, Architecture, and Taste. Founded in 1995, London-based FAT, whose principals also include Charles Holland and Sam Jacob, has gained international acclaim with a rather audacious approach to architecture. I kind of stole that line from Obama, but we'll see. It's the architecture of hope, Sean. Now, more specifically, FAT's work embraces the unspoken other side of modern architecture: pattern, ornament, color, symbolism, popular taste, everything that you thought was exiled from modern architecture, all with unique wit and style. Operating from the premise that architecture is a form of communication and that it should speak the language of its users, FAT has developed a reputation for making buildings that are memorable, legible, engaging, inclusive, and responsive. Their diverse and growing body of work includes such early projects as the offices for the advertising agency Kassels Kramer in Amsterdam, which is a kind of creative playground located within a historic Gothic church. The now iconic Blue House in London with its billboard-like expression of the building's home and office components, or such things as the bicycle surveillance hut. I don't know if that's the technical term for that structure, but in The Hague in the Netherlands, which they dubbed as a monument, that eventually found its way onto a postage stamp honoring public art in the Netherlands. FAT's more recent work has grown in scale and complexity, includes the design for the St. Lucas Art Academy, also in the Netherlands, which received the prestigious European Award from the Royal Institute of British Architects. It was also nominated for the Mies van der Rohe Award. The Woodward Place Social Housing Program for Manchester, a proposal for refurbishment and expansion of a 1960s high-rise housing block, or its soon-to-be-completed suburban hobby park in Rotterdam, the design of which is featured in the exhibition Worlds Away, New Suburban Landscapes, which is on view in our Target gallery. The work of FAT, of course, has been widely published and exhibited. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sean Griffiths to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for turning out on what is the coldest night I have ever known, by about 10 degrees. But I quite like it. It's rather refreshing. I'm very pleased to be here, and I was very pleased to be invited on behalf of our practice to take part in the exhibition in this magnificent building. And when I got here today, I was even more pleased because there are a number of my heroes in this exhibition, artists like Dan Graham and the group Sight, who did the best supermarket stores, which there's a couple of fantastic films about, and architects like Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, who were featured at length in the catalogue of the exhibition, although not in the show. And the reason I have an admiration for those particular people, amongst others, is because of what I see as an understanding of suburban space. And I'm going to talk tonight about our work or particular projects that I think relate to the notion of suburbia, and in particular to the exhibition. It's not everything that we do, but there is no doubt that there's a particular interest that we have in this subject matter, which exhibits itself also in urban projects as well as things that are more obviously suburban. And one of the reasons I think that we're interested in suburbia is because our practice is about questioning certain ways of thinking, I think, in architecture, in particular the way that architects conceive of space. I always think architects conceive of space as something similar to the way in which sculptors think of clay. It's something to be moulded into a shape, and particularly at the moment I think we have a slightly too much of architecture supposedly being about making the latest new shape, which I personally find rather dull. And I think one of the reasons we're interested in suburbia is because it's a spatiality that architects generally love to hate. Possibly because they don't understand it, and possibly because it certainly doesn't fit their conception of space, but it's also to do with, I guess, the type of people who live in suburbia, who are not architects. They're kind of generally middle class, probably vote for George Bush, and exhibit strange tendencies like wife swapping and things like that, I've heard. Maybe it's not so bad after all. And I think the kind of the conception of suburbia as being a space of conformity, which I actually disagree with. That's a very simplistic view. I mean, in England, for example, punk rock, which is the most radical musical movement of the last 30 years, was really born in suburbia. And where you get conformity, of course, you always get a reaction against that conformity. And I think that expresses itself in lots of interesting ways in suburbia. This is a piece of work. I mean, our practice, we do buildings and we do urban plans, but we also do art installations and all kinds of strange things, some of which you'll see tonight. And this is a piece from an exhibition that we made, which was about the notion of architectural space. And it's a slogan, taste, not space. And it refers to a certain degree to a suburban view of the world. Architects think in terms of space. Apart from architects and Captain Kirk of the Starship Enterprise, nobody else talks about space. They talk about rooms or corridors or gardens or things like that. And space is a kind of abstracted entity. It's neutral, whereas taste isn't. Taste exhibits things that are to do with your social position, to do with your education, to do with your ethnic identity. And I always have believed, well, I've believed for a long time that there's a strange conflation in the views that architects have of the world, that there is a relationship between good taste and good design, which I don't think exists. I think that good taste is often promoted as good design. And I noticed this, I think, having seen the exhibition, which I think generally is a fantastic exhibition and very interesting and contains a number of different views of suburbia. But I noticed a lot of the architects' contributions to it are attempts to kind of urbanize suburbia, to make it more tasteful, more urbane. And I think that kind of completely misses the point, because suburbia actually isn't about good taste at all. It's about the opposite. And so I'm kind of interested in that notion. And this stuff's been covered before. I mean, it was certainly not the first to think in this way. This is not by us, unfortunately. If it was by me, I'd be very rich. It's by Richard Hamilton, a British pop artist, and this is a space that's depicted. It's called "What is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing?" Made in the 1950s, and is an embracing of American consumer culture from the point of view of a young artist living in austerity post-war Britain and loving all of this pop culture. But it's a space that's made of surfaces, completely different from the way architects think about space as a kind of interpenetrating set of volumes. Similarly, and I was delighted to put this in my exhibition and discover it's actually in the show, this picture, with these pieces, these photographs by Dan Graham, made I think in 1966, of suburban tract houses. And again, this kind of interest in the relationship of something that might be high art, but which uses as its subject things that are not high art. And let's not forget what suburbs are about. This is a picture taken in London around about the turn of the 20th century. And, you know, it describes the poverty, disease, squalor of city living that suburbs have offered often working class, blue collar people the chance to escape historically. And so we ought to be careful when we are snooty about the suburbs that there's a kind of good reason why they're very successful in offering people like this an opportunity to escape. She lives somewhere near Minnesota, apparently, at, in Minneapolis, rather. Yeah, I've seen people like that walking down the streets in parts of America, unfortunately. But also that the suburbs are part of a much kind of wider trend that is to do with technological developments. This is a series of images which describe the development of the railway network in England from the middle of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. And you know, these things are obviously very important in the development of the idea of the suburb, of something that can be a certain distance away from a major centre. And of course that's been taken over by the automobile as the driver. This is the English version of the typical suburban dwelling, and a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about is obviously English rather than American. And this is a thing called a semi-detached house, which is one of the most popular housing forms in England and in the UK generally. Basically, it's two houses which are attached, which are disguised as one house. And I won't go into it in too much detail, but there's a particular way in which that was conceived and the way it was used. And what's interesting, I think, about suburban houses, which is something that architects could learn a lot from, is how much they're able to accommodate change. And over the years, and we've done a lot of studies of suburban houses, you find, for example, that two rooms are knocked into one big room, and that coincides with the coming of television. It means you can eat and watch TV at the same time. Front gardens become given over to car parking, obviously, as families that initially had no cars got one and then two cars. Extensions are built on the back. And so, whereas architects conceive of something like a house being in terms of space, the suburbia is something that unfolds over time. It's an architecture of time, and it changes. And it's one of the reasons why it's very successful. And also the way in which it's used is interesting. This is a plan of the street I grew up in. I was born on the outskirts of Liverpool, and the black boxes are semi-detached houses, and the one on the top left from your perspective is where my friend lived, and the one at the bottom right is where I lived. And we used to play football, or soccer as you call it here, in the street. And of course a soccer pitch isn't shaped like that, but we used to use the gate posts of the where the car goes into the garage as goalposts because of a kind of ideal size and shape. And so it's very interesting the way, say, for example, kids appropriate space and change its use and change its meaning way beyond the way any architect actually conceived it. Of course, architects have nothing to do with any of this. They don't design suburban houses. But that's kind of quite interesting, I think. And another example is the development, and I'm sure you have this here, of the teenager's bedroom. And a little thing like this, you know, the name on a door which says, "Do not dare enter into this domain," is a way in which a space which is a kind of territory manifests itself. And it's interesting in terms of a typical family, a mum and a dad and the kids, that they tend to have their own territories within a house, a suburban house. And then, you know, there's this kind of idea of the banality of suburban space. This is the kind of thing that you find in suburban areas where the bus comes once every week or something, and people say, well, this is banal and boring, but these things are used in lots of interesting ways. I in my formative years, had many interesting experiences in spaces like this, and long to again. But the use of space, I think, is interesting. I think in suburban spaces, uses are not something that's brought into consideration when we tend to be critical. And again, people territorialize the suburban space in different ways. So in this example, it's about trying to bring in something which is apparently natural and decorative. And of course, there's a very strong relationship between the idea of nature and suburbia. People move to suburbia because they think they're living in an urban environment, but which is also somehow close to nature. The irony being that suburban environments are perhaps the most unnatural environments you could almost think of. And then there's the kind of idea of nostalgia, and a lot of suburban houses in England have this Elizabethan half timbering, which you also found in Hollywood, of all places. But again, this is a sort of very interesting thing, because it's I think in England it's cultural. It refers to the sort of birth of England as a great nation under the reign of Elizabeth I. That's what this is being expressed. There's a kind of nationalism, which even extends to the cars, where you get this kind of. Unfortunately, this is a rather old car. They don't make them like this anymore. But this is the English version of your fabulous American cars with the kind of streamlining and go faster stripes. The English do Elizabethan half timbering on their cars. And very early on, we got interested in this. We were commissioned in 1995 to design a nightclub in a town called Swindon, which is about 70 miles from London, and is a small town of about 50,000 people, most of whom would live in suburban houses. And so the conception of this was that it was a kind of very contemporary design, but which alluded to spaces that were very, very familiar. So it had a running track, it had things that were a bit like a swimming pool, it had references to sports fields and airports. And so the idea being that the kind of relatively unsophisticated Swindon kid would turn up and they'd kind of get it. And there's also a shed, which is a very important part of the English suburban landscape. It's usually where the man of the house keeps his large collection of pornographic magazines. And when we made this space, we were sort of quite enthralled to people like Rem Koolhaas, and there was this kind of idea of creating this contemporary space in this little town, and that kids would come in here and go kind of, wow, this is really amazing. But they'd also recognise that the carpet was like a running track and it was a bit like a swimming pool. And the idea was that sort of boy meets girl in here, and they would retire to this space, which is a bit like their mum and dad's living room, in order that they can make out on these rather wonderful couches. And this was a very important space. It's a tiny room in a nightclub, but we always had a problem about what kind of furniture do you put in a room, and so finding this furniture, which of course no self-respecting architect would ever put into any of their designs, was rather interesting and provocative. But it's a sort of space of narrative. It has this garden shed which is clearly contemporary because it has this sort of horizontal slot bar and blue light. And then the space was made a little bit surreal by the inclusion of these concrete logs. And it's meant to be suburban in the way, kind of in a Twin Peaks, David Lynch sort of way. It's a sort of slightly sort of sinister. But this was the first project we ever got published. And when I showed my friends in the architectural world this, and they went, "Oh wow, Sean, that's fantastic, so contemporary." And then they show them that, and they go, "Oh, what the hell are you doing?" And when they said that and kind of acted in revulsion in relation to this, I thought, well, we're on to something here. This is rather interesting. And so this kind of suburban theme found its way into many projects of all kinds. This was looking at, again, a typical English suburban house and how it might be recoded with a slightly different iconography, sort of suggesting perhaps the dreamscape of the inhabitants in some way, and that also manifested itself in this amazingly tasteful interior. And we were also, I mean, as well as having difficulty in choosing furniture, fonts we also have problems with. So we invented this font called Mock, which is based on recreating a sort of Tudor, Elizabethan Tudor pattern, which manifests itself as the alphabet. And we put this to use in 1999. We were asked to make an exhibition in Manchester, in a gallery which is exclusively for architecture. And we used this, the exhibition was called Kill the Modernist Within, and that first image I showed, Taste Not Space, was also part of it. This actually says in font, Kill the Modernist Within. The O is the sort of in the centre of the picture there, and it goes around. If you look very carefully, you can see that it says that. It's not particularly easy to read. Functionality is not, form does not follow function here. But what the people of Manchester who would attend this gallery were used to seeing were like drawings, plans, sections, models, photographs of buildings. And so they were completely and utterly bamboozled by this. And I always remember being at the opening and nobody spoke to us at all. But it was about trying to say, well, look, there are other languages out there. There's a kind of culture of, if you like, the environment that we as architects do not tune into and ignore, partly on grounds of taste, partly on grounds of politics, but partly in terms of the very restrictive thinking about what spaces that architects have. This is another piece that was in the same exhibition. It's just simply called Neon House. And it has the same attitude that suburban house builders have to that image. It's about recreating that kind of archetypal child's image of what a house is. And it's a little bit out of date because, of course, you don't have TV aerials anymore. You have cable or satellite, but it has a fireplace and a porch. But obviously rendered in a very kind of reduced, symbolic way in neon. And then, coincidentally, for many, many years, we had toiled away at this stuff and, had very little success in the UK in actually winning commissions, although we did have a few in Holland where they're crazy enough to employ us every now and again. But we won a competition after many attempts at various competitions to do a housing scheme in Manchester. And yes, this is the story. Isn't that nice? This isn't a suburban scheme. it's in the centre of Manchester. It's about 10 minutes walk from the city centre. It's what would be called an inner city scheme. But there was an attempt to make it suburban, because going back to that image of that poor woman from the 19th century that I showed, there's been a long tradition in England of working class people wanting to move to the suburbs. Their aspirations are suburban. And I'm sure that's very similar to here. And so, in the original design that was done for these people in inner city Manchester, there is an attempt, an architect's attempt to do suburbia, which you can see on your left. It has like a little front garden and a fence. But it's that architect's view of the world where, you know, all the doors are the same. It has horizontal windows. It has a kind of unity, architect's vision of space. And of course, it's completely unsuccessful, as you can see from the image. And just up the road is another housing which is privately owned, but also relatively modest. But as you can see, that doesn't have the same problems as the one on the left. And this is an interesting image which describes a particular moment in time where politics and architecture came face to face with each other. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected, much to the regret of many people. But one of the reasons she was elected is she got a lot of votes from working class people. And one of the reasons she got a lot of votes from working class people is because she offered to sell them their local authority owned housing. The public housing was sold very cheaply to people who lived in it. So they saw an opportunity to better themselves by getting onto the property ladder. Now, the original architect's design would be like the image I showed earlier. If residents had any choice, it was about what colour door they could have. And of course, as soon as these houses were sold, you had this incredible explosion of, dare I say, creativity. And this is what people started doing. It was an expression of owning your own home. And of course, even though these things were in urban areas quite often, clearly there's a suburban mentality at work. And the interior of this house, which you can see in the image below, which I just think is fantastic, I think he's like kind of Renaissance, you know, Leonardo's Renaissance man in the circle. Well, he's like that, but he's in his new arch that he's made to knock his two rooms into one. And I actually do believe that is one of the most architecturally innovative fireplaces that I've ever seen. It's the only one I know that goes around a corner like that, at least. And of course, for architects, this is just appalling. You know, it's completely the opposite of what architecture is supposed to be about. But clearly, there's something about it that is working. When we entered the competition for the housing in Manchester, we were told that because the whole area was being redeveloped by a very trendy developer called Urban Splash, and the idea was that they built lots of new high design apartment blocks, and by doing so, they'd make lots of money, and out of all of the money that they made, they would rehouse all of the existing residents from this working class area. And they offered initially the residents new apartments in these, you know, flashy design buildings. The residents said, no, we want to live in houses and we want our community to, you know, stay together. And this is the kind of people we were designing for. And the brief asked for world-class architecture because it had to sit in a master plan designed by a very famous architect called Will Alsop. But houses that ordinary people will like. And we looked at the brief and we thought we are the only architectural practice in the entire world who can do that. And that's what we wrote in our submission. And to our great shock and surprise, they agreed with us and they gave us the job. This is the scheme as a whole. All of the black bits are apartment buildings designed by Will. It's in a very interesting area of Manchester. Manchester, as you probably know, was the original industrial city. It was the first city of the Industrial Revolution. And this is where it happened, exactly on this site. And so there are these canals that were initially used for transportation of goods from factories and warehouses and so on. And this is about extending the canal to create a leisure environment. And the bit that we were asked to do is in pink at the top of the image. And the kinds of things that are being built around there, this is a building designed by Will Alsop. It's called Chips, which is our word for fries, and it's like 3 chips sitting on top of each other because people here eat lots of fish and chips, the traditional English dinner. But as you can see, it's kind of contemporary architecture. When we went into the residents' houses where they lived, this is what we found. And I think this is one of the most incredible environments I've ever been in my life. And, you know, and we were terrified when we went, because we thought, well, how are we going to design anything anywhere near as good as that? And it's just absolutely astonishing. And it's also interesting because most of the people who live on this estate are over 50, working class, and this is a kind of vernacular architecture for those people, and you know, it expresses lots of things. Don't know quite what the Ku Klux Klan hat in the middle is about, but the half timbering, Marie Antoinette next to the TV, the various bits of nature, plants and ceramic ducks, and a rather interesting collection of dogs. I think there's a little kind of Buddha in the corner. An amazing array of things, and you know, there's just absolutely tons of this. This is another example. And we were just thrilled. We were very inspired by seeing this, and because we were inspired, I think the resident groups. I mean, look at that. Would you not like to have that in your house? Look at the fish tank. It's just amazing. And, you know, people do laugh at this. I mean, and one of the reasons I always show these, because, you know, I always think architecture lectures are really boring, actually. And at least if you give people a laugh, they go home happy, even if they hate your work. And, you know, we genuinely love this stuff. We're genuinely interested in it, and we think it's a social phenomenon. It's an expression of a particular kind of working class culture that doesn't usually get expressed in architecture. You know, and this extends to the outside. This is an existing house of the ones that were going to be demolished and replaced. But this is someone who I think has bought their own house, and they've put these leaded light windows in. And look at that garden. I mean, what an amazing contribution to the public realm that is, you know, and the love and the care and the devotion that's gone into making that is an expression of, you know, someone's deep love of their home. These are the plans of the houses that we designed, and they try to reflect particular aspects of northern working class culture, which is, yeah, a separate living room at the front from when the priest comes around on a Sunday for a cup of tea and a drop of whiskey. A lot of Irish people live in this area. Kitchen and dining room at the back, a carport at the front, which is actually an open yard, a relationship to the garden. And when they're all put together, they're like this. And basically the plans are L-shaped. And one of the reasons for that was, one, we had to accommodate off-street parking, because in this area the perception was if you parked a car on the street, when you came to drive it the next morning there would be no wheels on it. And so off-street parking was a security measure. But the L-shaped plans also create the illusion, in what is actually what you would call a row house, of a terraced house, of a semi-detached house. And they also create these sort of little neighbourly front yards where people talk to each other. And this idea of the thing that was actually a row house but being like a semi-detached house was also expressed in the design of the facades, and the facades are a very powerful part of the design. They're partly designed because of the kinds of buildings that are going to be next door to them. We don't want this to be a kind of, you know, quivering little house next to these very flamboyant apartment blocks. These have to stand up, so that they're sort of made with these very flamboyant facades, and the brick patterns are inspired by those interiors that we saw earlier. And they express themselves both as semi-detached houses, because they also have different tops. They're also expressing the individuality of the owner, but they kind of work all together to create the sense of a single community with individuals within them. And this is how it was conceived that it would look. This is how we designed it, and residents had a choice about the window types and the balconies and where the balcony went, and that gave a sense of kind of variety to the design, which is again something architects generally don't do. They tend to make everything look the same. But importantly, because the design itself was quite powerful, it enabled this to happen. And one of the things that I think is really, really key about a suburban notion of space is this additive process where things change over time and people add things to their homes and personalize them. And this is very clearly illustrated in the exhibition here. How this adding of symbolism gives a very personalized dimension to the space. So these are the houses as built. And I'll just run through. You can see here this expression of the two houses. At the back, it's a piece of blatant facadism. At the back, they're kind of modernist boxes. But at the front, they have this facade, which expresses the individuality of the owners, but also this sense of being both a terrace or row house and a semi-detached. You can see very clearly how the facade is something quite separate. You can see those fantastic mills in the background there, which are now sort of listed monuments, because that's where wool was first turned into garments that were sold and made Manchester rich, although its inhabitants were rather poor. You can see some other aspects of the context in that. This is a 3-story block which contains, and it's very interesting, when we first started dealing with these residents and we suggested 3-story houses, they'd never seen 3-story houses. They thought we were completely mad. That's how restricted their view of what housing could be. And you can see the role that this brick patterning and a little detail on the wall, which is a little bit like the top of a tree. So there's a sort of, again, the notion of the bucolic or of nature is strongly expressed. And round the backs, this is a very typical arrangement for an English working class house, where there's a back alley, which is essentially for putting your dustbins out, your trash cans, and but becomes a social space. A lot of the people who live in this community will move between their houses using this little alleyway at the back. And the colours were another area where the residents had some choice. They could choose the colours of their houses. And inside, we were able to, on a very tight budget, offer a little bit of detail that gave some character to the houses in some of the staircase treatments. And this is Terry. As you can see, he's really enjoying himself in his new house. And Terry is one of the owners of one of those marvellous fireplaces. And we imagined that these residents, when they moved in, would start to decorate their houses like the old ones. But as you can see, Terry has quite sort of contemporary taste now. And we said, well, Terry, where's all this where's your bar? He also has the bar. And he said, oh, I don't want any of that now. I said, why not? He said, well, I live in a modern house now, don't I? So there's always this fantastic irony that people can never, as an architect, you can never depend on people to behave in the way that you expect them to. Even if you are starting from a slightly different viewpoint. That's Terry's rather marvellous back garden. And, so I think, there's a sort of genuine feeling that I think we have for these kinds of spaces, things that are usually excluded from the realm of architecture. But certain of the tropes that manifest themselves in that scheme were first played out in this project, which, although it's pink in the picture, became known as the Blue House. And basically, it's a house with an office in it, and it uses this notion of the additive of the two-dimensional surface decoration, figurative element, basically to put the finger up to so-called contemporary design, which kind of endlessly is played out in London at the moment. And it has kind of decorative features like the top, but it also has a certain amount of abstraction about it. And again, these ideas are about taking suburban tropes, the shape of the house, that kind of archetypal child's drawing of a house. But as you can see here, it's a very tight urban site. The house forms a kind of L shape, and the bottom leg of the L is the garden. And that's the front facade as built. It also has the little tree growing out of the fence, and the kind of negative of that, which looks like someone's taken a bite out of the fence a little bit further along. It has a little chimney, which of course is completely fake, and it's a two-dimensional stick-on to the front. It's a house with an office, so it's a little house with a little office block behind it. And it goes against everything you're meant to do in architecture, which is deal with space and 3 dimensions and you know, it's surface. But you know, there's a long tradition of that in architecture. If you look at Palladio's buildings, they often have superimposed facades, and it was never seen as being something that was a problem, say, in the Renaissance. And also that I think facades are incredibly important. They are the interface between buildings and the street. Most people know most buildings by the front of that building, because they don't go into most buildings. So, you know, it's an incredibly important relationship between a building and its environment. But there are little games that go on, which I suppose are more high art. You know, there's a kind of idea that on the side it's a big house, whereas on the front it has a kind of Disneyland type scale, so it's sort of 3/5 scale. And so there's a kind of dislocation of those two scales, which makes it quite difficult to tell where the floors are in the building and what its true height is. And a lot of people think those 3 sets of windows at the top, those 3 strips, are all different floors, when in fact they're just one floor. And it's quite hard to tell how big the rooms are. And then in the left, because of the way that the windows are articulated and the way the treatment of the facade ends, it suddenly reveals itself as a very two-dimensional, almost like a child's drawing or a cardboard cutout, something cut out with a chainsaw. And there's a little bit of that on the top as well. But these are, again, is a sort of play on a suburban trope in an existing environment. That also extends to a degree to the plan. You know, I think one of the great influences on house design at the moment are TV chefs. Because, you know, my mother would cook in a kitchen which was separated from other rooms. But now, because of people like Nigella Lawson, do you get Nigella Lawson over here? She's gorgeous, isn't she? You know, especially when she puts that strawberry in her mouth in a particular way. But because of that kind of showmanship about cooking, the relationship between a kitchen area and a dining space and a garden becomes very important. And you know, I think TV has had a huge influence on the way that houses are laid out. And there's a little bit of that in this. You know, here you can see the sort of relationship of the garden. But on the right-hand side is one of these kind of plays of the idea of an interpenetrating modernist idea of space and a more suburban idea of space, which is a series of rooms. I mean, this is a building that's constructed as a masonry construction. It's not a frame. But, for example, you see it's also clearly 2 rooms, because there's an archway that leads from one room into the other. But on the other side, there's another hole. And that makes that column very ambiguous, because it's sort of a remnant, a fragment of a wall, but it's also a column because of the way that the architrave goes around the edge. And so what we were trying to do is play a quite sort of sophisticated game between those two conditions of what a contemporary space is and what a room is. You know, you can see the way that gets used, because the telephone is nearby, it gets covered in little messages, and the fireplace area begins to get decorated with stuff. And as you move up through the house, you can go up the house on a staircase that goes up behind the fireplace. That gives a view of kind of some of the complexity that goes in. Always boring to look at drawings, actually. But yeah, at the front of the house, the staircase kind of winds around, and it takes you through a whole series of different spaces that have quite different characteristics. So as you wind round, it's like this modernist house is placed inside this rather cookie, funny South Park type house. and the staircase winds around the edge of it, and you can see it going up there. And there are lots of bits where the fakeness of the house shape sort of reveals itself because it's a sort of double height space, and the thickness of that extra facade plonked on the outside creates a window seat on the staircase. And there are various gaps where, as this building within a building gets pulled back from the facade and creates these light wells. And this is a very interesting one. It's above the kitchen, and that grating there is actually meant to be just to access the big window you see on the side facade. But what used to happen is, like, kids love this space, and they go on, and the adults would be having dinner or lunch underneath, and the kids would throw things at them from. So again, this sort of notion of how spaces get subverted and used in ways that you never thought. This is a child's bedroom, playing with a sort of layering of, again, these sort of archetypal house forms, like the crossed window that you find in suburbia. And as you go up, you arrive in a bedroom where there's a very different, almost like a slice of another kind of house, which is placed inside, and a deliberate use of things like architraves and panelled doors, traditional elements, but which are distorted by having two doors next to each other that have different sized architraves. So there's, again, a sort of weird scale thing going on. And also, I don't know how clearly you can see it, but the doors look like they're too big for the openings. So there's a sort of strange, almost traditional, but very surreal interpretation of what a door might be. And that came about through just thinking, what can we do with a door? Because we don't want yet another kind of shadow gap and plain door that's in a million so-called contemporary spaces. And there's the light flooding in through the windows. That's the 3 windows on the top of the house that enter into the bedroom. And so this kind of playing of a figuration, which I would say is a sort of suburban trope, plays itself out in other environments that we're doing. This is a restaurant in a sophisticated department store in London called Meals at Heels. And basically it's a Trompe d'oeil forest. Here are some, at the bottom you can see some booths. And this is a kind of layout. This is kind of laid out in a very straightforward way. But this is in the West End, and it's almost too sickly to be able to eat anything in there. We haven't had a feedback from the client about whether people find themselves a little bit overindulged. But clearly, it's almost like a sweet suburbia taken to a little bit like, it's a similar attitude to, you've seen a movie like Blue Velvet, where the opening scene where you see the American typical white picket fence rendered in these incredibly vibrant colours, and it's so beautiful and so innocent that it actually oversteps into something that's actually a bit weird and a bit sicko. And I guess this is what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to make people feel ill while they eat, but some people do, apparently. So this client hasn't rehired us to make the additional restaurants he's designing. This is a project, I actually don't show this very often. When we started off our practice, we were very unemployed, and we started doing kind of other things because no one would give us any buildings to do. And one of the things we used to do was work with artists and work on projects where art could integrate itself into things that people do in an everyday kind of way. And this was one where we had 30 artists who each made a shopping bag. And some of these were like top artists, people like Jake and Dinos Chapman and Peter Blake and Julian Opie, and we exhibited them in a gallery. But the idea was you went shopping in the West End and you got one of these bags, and it's a kind of suburban idea about how you might make an art gallery, because the art goes home on the bus with you back to the suburbs. So there's this kind of notion of a kind of urbanism which again is like non-defined, is not fixed by architectural forms, or is not determined by architectural forms, and that these would end up being both part of the everyday but also quite valuable objects in themselves, but would move around the city. And again, we're quite often involved in making installations, and this again has a sort of slightly suburban qualities in more ways than one. This was an installation we made at the Royal Institute of British Architects in London, and the idea was it was the world's first inflatable folly. So that big sphere at the back is inflatable, and the thing at the front, which as you can see carries on the Elizabethan theme, is the way that you get into it. And you can probably see little dots on the ball, and they are holes that when you go inside it looks like this. You get this sort of planetarium. But this is not a constellation you would ever see in the sky, because this layout was derived from a map of Los Angeles, which is has pinpointed on the map all of the homes of the stars. And so it's a very fantastically suburban constellation. And yeah, somebody else standing on this balcony contemplating throwing themselves off, no doubt. And this is what inspired it, which is Boulet's cenotaph to Newton. He'd probably come back to haunt us if he could, if he wasn't a rationalist. This is this kind of structure that you stand on before the blooms. But these are my favourite pictures of it, kind of slightly saggy. But again, it's great to put something that looks like that in the Royal Institute of British Architects. And again, another one which we were commissioned to make this by the British Council for an exhibition in China. And they asked for something that would exhibit British culture to the Chinese. And what the brief for this was, we wanted an environment that would be appropriate for a celebrity couple. And they had in mind a chap called David Beckham, who I think is now resident in this parish, and his wife, former Spice Girl Victoria Beckham, otherwise known as Posh Spice. And there was this idea that they could, the only place that you could escape from the paparazzi was in the bathroom. And so this is a bathroom for David and Victoria, and it's made up from very typical bathroom elements from a typical bathroom store, oval-shaped baths that are cut and put together, so you get this kind of heart shape, and the two shower heads intertwine. And the heart shape and the intertwining shower heads, of course, express David and Victoria's love for each other. But it goes further than that. You can do everything together. And I associate this forever with the town of Charlotte in North Carolina, because I remember arriving there. I was changing planes and going somewhere else, and I suddenly realized that given the shapes of some of the people who were walking around in that airport, there was actually a market potentially for this. Now I'm in the good old United States. If anybody knows anybody who could help me out with this, I'd be very grateful to know. But I mean, there's something about this incredibly surreal object being made out of very ordinary things. Now, this is the piece that's illustrated and exhibited here, and I think it's perhaps the most directly suburban project we've done. It's about a town called Hoogvliet, which is on the outskirts of Rotterdam in Holland. It's pink on the map, and Rotterdam is structured in such a way as the city has lots of satellite towns around it called new towns, and new towns were specially built towns made after the Second World War based on the principles of Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City that were designed to create new spaces for people whose houses had been bombed during the war. And again, this attitude that cities were desperately unhealthy places and that people should move out to the countryside. And these were often related to industry. So you can sort of see a highway going through the middle of the image there. Below that is the town of Hoogvliet. Above it is an enormous petrochemical plant which used to employ everybody who lived in Hoogvliet. And this is what Hoogvliet looks like. It's based on a suburb, but it's actually a piece of socialist planning. And you can see the petrochemical plant, you can see the River Maas, which is part of the Rhine. You can see a highway between the petrochemical plant, and you can see a band of trees which separate the petrochemical plant from the town. And those bands of trees are what's called a blast zone. You can't build houses there too near to the petrochemical plant in case it blows up. Or Mr. Bin Laden decides to visit. And we were asked to come in by a group called Crimson, who are a very interesting bunch of Dutch urbanists who describe themselves as architectural historians, but have very interesting ideas about how we might remake places like this. And we started by thinking, well, what does Hoogvliet dream of? And again, there's this notion of the bucolic, of the natural, is kind of at the root. And because it's rationalist Dutch planning, you get these very typical, very well designed Dutch housing, which is typical of the place. And but what's interesting is all this stuff, again, the suburban idea of the additive, and a kind of little analysis that we did here of all of the different things that were alluded to from on the left of the picture, the coaching lamp, with dreams of coaches and horses going past, to below that an anchor, which of course is the natural thing to put in a garden. The crazy paving, which relate to some kind of idea of the countryside. One of those things, I don't know what they're called, that you tie a rope around for mooring a ship, which presumably would have sailed in on that pond. And then, of course, nature done in plastic, which is represented by the stork, which probably alludes to some notion of fertility. And then, the awning is both French brasserie, but also it's orange, and you get everybody's orange in Holland. They're kind of mad. It's sort of national colour. And so there's an incredible array of symbolic references which are superimposed on this very rationalist, modernist Dutch housing. There's another example of a little coach lamp on the side there. And of course, we're fascinated by this. Now, this project is very interesting because there's a particular political moment happening in Holland, which this project coincides with, where you probably know about the Dutch tradition for liberalism and tolerance, and you can smoke a bit of the old stuff legally over there, and they're very open about prostitution, and they have a very kind of long tradition of tolerance. But that's changed recently because, particularly in Rotterdam, they did a population survey and discovered that more than 50% of the population were immigrants, i.e. suddenly all the very tolerant liberal Dutch thought, hang on, there's more of them than there is of us. And this has actually led to a profound sea change in Dutch politics, where quite right-wing anti-immigration politicians have made a lot of headway. And this is something that was also characteristic of this town, Hoogvliet, where it was about the same, 50-50 immigrants and indigenous Dutch. The immigrants tended to live in social housing. The indigenous Dutch tended to live in private housing. There was tension between the communities. And we discovered all kinds of interesting things went on in this town. For example, the immigrant community, particularly the West Indies, had a lot of parties, which were great parties, apparently, unless you happened to live next door to them. But there were things like heavy metal bands. There was people who did pigeon fancying, you know, racing pigeons. There were people who were into vegetable growing. There was a lot of people who had barbecues, and this was all hidden behind the scenes. And one of the things that we discovered was that this is Sam, my colleague, has an obsession with pet cemeteries. He's wanted to do one since he was about 4 years old. And so we proposed a pet cemetery, and this is a sort of diagram of it. And this was the thing that was the kind of turnkey moment on that project, because we discovered that Rotterdam's pet cemetery was full, and they needed a new one. And that provided the funding to do this project. And so this kind of developed this idea, and there was a notion of that Hoogvliet would become the coolest place in Holland, and it would have this big sign like the Hollywood sign, but with pigeon lofts at the bottom, and that it would have this big hall where you could go and have parties or a vegetable growing competition, and that the hall would be a communicative thing with an additive attitude to the way it was decorated. So it would be a little bit this, which is actually St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, but also a little bit of this, which is actually the kind of stuff that you find around there. Eventually this kind of notion of a park developed, the hobby park as it became called, which was basically a landscape where all of the things that went on in private, these suburban activities, could be done in a communal space in some way, which not only took it took some of the conflicting things like the parties out of the housing, but it also brought people together. It's a bit of social engineering. And so that was a kind of image, and this was an early version of the party hall, which is meant to express a tremendous civic optimism, but also has a kind of play of a series of references at the top of the image to the strange petrochemical plant, but combined with this bucolic, these are sort of tree shapes, and that was something that was an important part of the imagery. And this is a plan of it. It's just a big hall, and it had a cafe and spaces that people could rent. And this was how the park actually, this is the kind of closest manifestation to what they're actually building at the moment. And it has the pet cemetery, as you can see on the sort of bottom right, and a giant suburban patio in rather lurid colours, which has the villa as the party hall became known, and it has a beach and some hills, and these things called hobby huts, which are little spaces you can go and do your hobby in. So you can hire it out if you're in a thrash metal band, and then when you finish, the local boat making club will come and take over it. Or you can even perhaps run a small business. So these kind of ideas about these little huts that would have these particular characteristics, but that you could hire out. Here's some more of them. And so what developed was this notion of this park, and we, unbelievably to us, they decided to build it. And so we had to start developing all these elements that went in the park, from bridges, and that was one, and I think this is a different design. Because you also, to get in Holland, because it's mostly underwater and the water table is very high, in order to get dry land you have to dig, and so that the water can escape, and you always get this relationship between land and water. It's a bit like round here, actually. It's all completely flat, which is why you can add things like this, which is a sort of watchtower forming part of this park. And again, there was this play in the language of the bucolic, the kind of the supposedly natural in designs for park benches. And this is the place where, this is actually the place of internment for the pet cemetery. You can stand in here and say a little prayer for your budgerigar before it goes in the ground. And yeah, little things like this. This is the love terrace with the love seat for lovers. I'm not quite sure what you're supposed to do with the purple shed on legs, but I'm sure imagination can be found. And this was this idea, you can see the villa and this giant patio and the hobby huts and the bridges and so on. That's interestingly somebody's arm at the top of the picture. That's not actually part of the scheme. It's just because it's a model. Somebody's arm was in there. And a view of the villa, which is actually changed. And here's the little seat with the man sitting in it. And of course, one of the issues here is dealing with the local community, and we realised we were going to have to do a lot of digging to make this park. And so this idea was conceived that you would have a festival of mud, and you could make mud sculptures or drive a construction truck or a digger or scrambling. But they actually did develop into a thing where we did these very interesting festivals where you actually made, in a temporary way, bits of the park. And here, like, local bands performed for the local residents, and there were all of these interesting civic devices, gateways. Again, this kind of accumulative, figurative architecture, as opposed to abstract architecture. And fountains. Yeah, they're on sale for $10,000 each, if anybody's interested. And here they are actually making it. There's the petrochemical plant. Here's the hill we made, so it wouldn't all be flat, but it's also to screen the noise from the highway. Here's a man laying some grass. And on your right, you can see these little benches. The thing that's being constructed behind those benches is a hobby hut, and the thing in the middle of the picture is the villa under construction. Unfortunately, we couldn't afford the lurid patio, so we had to settle for painting our picnic tables bright pink. And these are some of the. This is a little bridge, which is a development of that house bridge that we saw. And some of the signage, again, very refers on the one hand to a rather sophisticated language of almost sort of Helvetica graphics, but mixed with a rather cheesy, bucolic, tree-like image, and but kind of rather beautifully made, using this kind of rusticated cutout timber. And this is the Helicide. Helicide means festival. So it's the festival bridge, which is the one with the text in the car park on the way there, and a close-up of the tree log benches. And this is the hall, which was described to me by one journalist as the most repulsive architectural object ever made, which I, of course, was incredibly proud about. But you can see, again, there's this kind of, in the openings, there's this sort of tree imagery, and it sort of abstracts itself in the timber screen. And the sort of goldy-coloured thing on the outside is the main entrance, which, again, is a sort of abstracted notion of a grove of trees that you enter into. And you can see the kind of abstraction of the factory in the iconography on the top. So it's about creating this imagery that brings together the urban and the rural. When you bring those two things together, you get a thing called the suburban. And here's some of the views of it. This is the Herzog de Meuron moment, where it looks almost respectable. And yeah, this bit at the bottom here is where the cafe spills out. You can see a hobby hut. These are just snapshots, so things are not finished yet, so it's not been properly photographed. But yeah, you can see a kind of bright yellow hobby hut in the back. And you can see it's maintained some of its urban qualities in contributions from the local community. And then inside it's, again, trying to play a game with a very, very basic building. It's a simple steel shed at the end of the day, but in the way these decorative things interact with the structural elements, and the way it's painted pink because it suddenly raises it to a different kind of level. And that's a view through one of the windows where you see one of those decorative cutouts. There's the park in all its glory, looking... that water, you just want to dive in there, don't you? It's not... I can see myself there in my swimming costume. There's a view out from this park, and obviously it's in a rather undeveloped state at the moment, and for example, there'll be grass up on that muddy bit. And then This is another project we're working on now. How am I doing for time? I'm coming to the end, so you haven't got long to wait if you're absolutely desperate, as I am, for a drink. This is a project which is part of the UK's largest zero carbon development in a town called Middlesbrough, which is about the sort of equivalent of sort of Cleveland, Ohio. So it's a really nice place. And Middlesbrough is an old industrial town that's fallen on hard times. This is an attempt to reinvigorate the local economy. And it's another master plan designed by Will Alsop. And it's basically in the docklands of Middlesbrough. And the first phase, the buildings basically on the left-hand side, which are called sugar cubes, they're designed by a variety of different architects, but the one thing that unifies them is that they're all cube-shaped. And so that's how the plan works out. And the first two buildings that are being done are looking at the bottom of the image with all of the cube-shaped buildings, the one that's kind of off-axis, which looks over a square and also over the water, and the one to the right of that are the first two buildings being built in this phase. It's going to be kind of interesting marketing these, because they're going to be these two buildings. It's in this like lunar landscape of total nothingness, with a howling wind blowing off the North Sea. So yeah, a very brave developer. And they actually are a very brave developer, because they are taking very seriously the sustainability agenda, and there's all kinds of targets to do with sustainability in this, to do with the embodied energy of the building, the heating systems, the way in which landscape and recreation spaces are incorporated into the building, and the way in which it's going to be managed. The building we're doing is the one that's off-axis, and Alsop are doing the building next door. So we have this kind sort of prominent thing that fronts onto the square, and is different from all the others because it's on that axis, and it actually faces directly north-south. So the square is to the north. And our original concept for this was a notion of a community in a cube. And that's why the building is called SIAC, which stands for Community in a Cube. It's really corny, isn't it? I know. But the idea was that this was a building that would have everything. It would be like a sort of community. It would contain everything. So this sketch is the notion of a kind of maximalist architecture that has everything in it. Sheds and snow and forests and haystacks. And as it developed, some of that was kind of retained, and obviously there's certain kind of pragmatic things. And we decided upon this rather straightforward modernist block that looked like it had fallen out of the sky and crushed a shed. And the idea is that the shed would be the local pub, which would sit underneath. So this is the sort of concept for the thing. And the cube has a hole in the middle, because that lets light through from the south side to illuminate the square, and it sort of manifests itself like this. So the sheds move to the other side, but that's going to be the pub, the local pub, so people can come down out of the block and go and have a drink and get together and be a community. Another key idea is that on top of this modernist block would be a little street of suburban houses, which is, the obvious thing to do, obviously. And so there it is. It has a little street of suburban houses on the top, which have become known as sky homes and are currently being marketed as Middlesbrough's most prestigious address. And then in plan, the block actually has a section carved out in the middle, and the idea was that, and this is important because of the sustainability credentials, was that there'd be this terraced garden that becomes a vertical garden, that there'd be this kind of green space that goes up through the middle of the building. And that green space is also one of the ways you could get into the building. So the red arrow on the bottom is you going straight into the lobby and up in the lift, and the zigzaggy arrow above that is you going up this set of terraces. And one of the things they're trying to promote in this is the idea of health and happiness, that you don't just get in the lift, you actually walk up some stairs and get a bit of exercise. And so that's how that is manifested. The sort of white bit in the middle is where all the lifts and stairs are, and you can see clearly this sort of terraced garden that steps up, and the top bit of the terrace is actually on top of a roof light that illuminates the entrance hall below. And you can see very clearly the sort of the suburban little street. Or it's more of a sort of new urbanist little street, actually, up at the top there. And so this is how this thing looks when you look into it from the south. It has this rather interesting sort of vertical space that you pass through in order to access your apartment, a kind of elevational view of it. And a sort of view of what it's like to be inside these walkways, looking at the sky homes and looking into the south-facing court. And this is meant to sort of illustrate how the way in which it's configured so that there's a certain permeability of light that can come through from the south side and pass through the building, through that hole at the front there, and illuminate the north side. The most interesting thing about the plan, really, at the ground floor is that it has an enormous biomass boiler, which will serve as incredibly energy efficient system, which will serve 5 of these cube buildings. And then as you go up, an attempt has been made to make the flats as sustainable as possible. So, for example, the yellow flats are dual aspect and look both outwards from the building, but also inwards to this courtyard. And then as you go up through the building, all of the apartments are effectively corner apartments, which means you get lots of natural light, which is actually very important because you don't put light switches on so much. You get cross ventilation, and you get a sense of space and view and so on in what are actually quite small apartments, because the way in the UK at the moment, land values drive the size of apartment that you can have because they're very high, which means you have to try and cram as many spaces on as possible to make the thing financially viable. And these are the plans of the sky homes at the top. And that's our model. And this is the biggest building we've ever done for a big developer. And so they've actually paid for a posh model. And you can see very clearly, if you like, the suburban tropes here with the houses on the top, but made rather surreal. The building on the left-hand side is the Alsop building, which was called Crusty because it used to have this rather interesting crusty exterior, a little bit like they've achieved on this building, actually. But then we had to do a bit of cost-cutting, and it's now called Smoothie. It was and you can see how the building relates to the square at the front, and how the pub that's in the chalet can open out onto that square, and you can see where the water is. And this gives you a sort of impression of what it might be like to be in that square looking at the building. The sort of multicoloured bit in the middle is where all the lifts are, and you can see that the way that the light can penetrate through the hole in the middle. The sky won't be like that because it'll be out in the open air when it's built. Another view of it. And again, this sort of shows how this light floods through. And a view from the south side, and looking towards the main entrance and into that courtyard. Sky homes on the top. And this is a view inside the courtyard with the walkways that get you to the apartments. And this stepped garden that moves up and eventually becomes a sort of vertical garden in this sort of loggia that accesses the flats. And this is the view from the drug squad helicopter, who are trying to get the guy who lives in Middlesbrough's most prestigious address at the top there, or the person who's decided to jump. The main entrance, and just finally a little what we call the monument, the bicycle surveillance unit, which is a little monument for a non-urban space. It's actually by the seaside in Scheveningen, which is the seaside resort of The Hague, and we were commissioned to make a little building that was for a guy to sit in, and you park your bicycle and you pay him €1 and he watches it and makes sure it's not stolen. And they have a number of these around the city, and they decided to do them as little artworks. And we wanted to make this thing that was like a monument but not, hence the name monument. And we also, again, the flat landscape of Holland we felt required a little hill. And so it has this kind of wall containing a hill with a little house on the top, and the man sits where the glass is. And this is a sort of response to the seaside architecture. Just down the road, there's a fantastic bar called the Jungle Bar, which has outside it a giant plastic griller holding a torch with real flames coming out the top. And this is designed, it has this little house on the top, and unfortunately I don't have a picture of it because it wasn't working at the time. But this house goes on fire every 15 minutes in tribute to the to the Griller Bar, the Jungle Bar down the road, and it does have quite sinister connotations, because what we later discovered was Scheveningen is there's a big prison there, and as you probably know, because your current president could well end up there. At The Hague, there is an international war crimes court, and the jail for that is here. And of course, Slobodan Milosevic, lately of Serbia, was imprisoned here. And so the idea of the little house going on fire suddenly began to get a little bit more sinister edge to it. And so if you can imagine that nice little suburban house on fire, seems to me to be a fitting memorial or moment to end this talk. And thank you very much for coming out and listening. I'm very happy to answer any questions, although I'm told you have to talk through a microphone, because otherwise people won't be able to hear what you say.
Have you thought about one of the issues is that, people will customize their homes themselves, and so have you thought about more looser frameworks whereby over a longer period that customization can happen?
Well, I think. Do you want to repeat that? I couldn't hear you.
Thank you very much. Now that I have the microphone, you're referencing of course, the standardization that comes with suburbia, and then the eventual customization that happens from the actual homeowners, and the occupants of those spaces. Have you ever thought of setting up a system whereby you couldn't necessarily control it, but you could guide maybe what that development is over a longer period of time, rather than appropriating the iconography and the symbolism?
I think in the scheme in Manchester, what we were trying to do was make something that it had to have a strong architectural intent because of what was going on around it. But the idea was that people would customise that, and that the architecture of it was strong enough to take it and retain its character with the customization. We always had this vision that we wanted people to actually put Elizabethan half timbering on the outside of it. Of course, nobody bloody has, because they're all so respectful of it. So I think it's very difficult to do that, because, as I said, people use buildings in completely unexpected ways and never behave in them in the way that you expect them to. So if you try to set up a process where you would as it were, control that process. I just think it'd be totally impossible. So I think what we're not necessarily saying is that that housing in Manchester is a model for all suburban development. It's an example of what possibly can be done with a different set of references to what is usually done by architects. Most architects, and we know a lot of them who are doing social housing, tend to do modernist, tasteful housing. And funnily enough, I think people are coming round to that. They kind of seem to quite like it. In fact, when we ever go into competition, if we ever show those schemes to a group of residents who we might be choosing an architect, we always lose to somebody who does something nice and tasteful.
I guess my question's sort of along those lines.
Where are you? Oh, thank you. I
But
could only hear you coming from there, so it sort of slightly perturbed me.
but the idea of creating something that is emulating in a way the ugliness or the tastelessness of suburbia, is the point to challenge us or challenge everybody to sort of accept what's ugly or tasteless about suburbia? Or what is the sort of function of that?
I think part of it is to question whether indeed it is tasteless and ugly. I mean, I think part of this, unfortunately, there's a kind of deep Freudian thing going on here, because I was brought up in a suburban, semi-detached house on the outskirts of Liverpool, which, was fine. I don't remember it being a particularly traumatic childhood. And I remember then going to architecture school and coming back and giving my mother a hard time about the way she'd done her kitchen, which was just amazingly arrogant, of course, and completely, because already you were sort of indoctrinated into viewing what had appeared to me to be, I mean, I never thought of it as being beautiful or not beautiful, but it suddenly became unbeautiful. And because I was a young architecture student, I imagined that was right. And so I guess it's about questioning what good taste is, because what we, as sort of maybe educated, visually aware people might think of as nice or beautiful, is not necessarily the same thing that somebody from a different cultural strata or social strata thinks of as beautiful. And I'm reluctant ever to say that we're trying to make housing that somehow presumes to touch the hearts of a certain social group of people. Partly because, I think I'm honest enough to say that, our aspirations are high architecture and to be featured in exhibitions at the Walker Art Centre in Minneapolis. But that there's a kind of questioning of architects' taste. And partly from a sort of political point of view, is of saying, well, actually, I think architects' taste is largely white, male and middle class on the one hand, but also saying to architects, well, look, there's a whole other range of stuff out there that we could be interested in that can make architecture more interesting. Because what shocks me in architecture generally is how similar it all is. That you can see a building, like, the building that Will's doing in Manchester, which I showed, looks a lot like a building I've seen by Stephen Hall, for example. And that, there's this incredible global similarity. And we're just trying to introduce something that maybe expands that a little bit and says there's other things you can look at.
Hey, can you just talk a little bit about the role of humor in your work? I feel like it was very present. And
yeah,
I'd love to hear
it's a very good question, and it's something that I mean, clearly that it's there. There's a certain desire to say, you know, why do we all take architecture so seriously all of the time? But at the same time, it is serious, and I think there are humorous elements, but we tend not to talk about them because it's a way in which certain people, I suppose, particularly in the UK, in the architectural establishment, can use to exclude us because it's not serious. It's all a big joke. It's taking the piss, which it kind of is and it isn't. I mean, the only people it's taking the piss out of is the architectural establishment. It's not, for example, you know, the images that we put up of those suburban interiors are not humorous to the people who live in them. They're humorous to this relatively sophisticated, visually aware, educated audience who, of course, are, as we all are, betraying our particular position socially in our finding that humorous. And it's interesting that you're allowed to do that. I mean, if it was some kind of African village I was showing, nobody, of course, would laugh because it would be completely not done to find, because, you know, it would be deemed as racist. So I think there's a sort of very ambiguous area about the kind of humour. In some cases, it clearly is the idea of a giant modernist block landing on a small chalet. You can't quite escape that. But in other ways, it isn't. And I think what we're trying to do is make work that we feel is relevant to the culture that we live in, and that we consider to be serious work. But I think there's a lot of interesting art that is serious work that also contains humour, but it tends not to come through in architecture very often. There's somebody at the back. Well, could you repeat that because it's being recorded?
Who can afford to live in your spaces?
The spaces we design, with the possible exception of the Blue House, which is an individual house. The scheme in Manchester, for example, is what we call affordable housing. It's designed for working class people who are renting, although they do have the opportunity to buy. And it's not high cost housing, it's not expensive. It's a tiny bit more expensive than the standard. But that housing is also, which I didn't talk about it in respect to that, but it's very environmentally friendly housing, and you get extra grants for designing environmentally friendly housing, and that helps make it a little bit to cover the cost of the fact that it's a little bit, but we're only talking about 5 to 10% more expensive than the bog standard house that they would normally live. So the housing in Manchester is deliberately aimed at people who you would consider to be poor people. The housing in Middlesbrough I showed towards the end is for private sale, but for a town which, like I said, is the equivalent of Cleveland, Ohio. So it's not. There's a market there which is not particularly buoyant in terms of people being able to afford expensive apartments, and within that, because it's a community in a cube, the houses at the top, the new urbanist houses at the top are kind of like the penthouses, and they are relatively expensive. But within the development, there are a series of, like the yellow flats that I pointed out, are relatively inexpensive and are affordable for somebody who's not particularly wealthy. And are very much aimed at that market. I mean, it's a developer, he has to sell them, so there's no point in making houses that people who are not that wealthy can't afford.
Hi. I thought that you were making a connection perhaps between territory and taste earlier in the lecture, and then I kind of didn't really see it continued on in some of the later projects, and I was wondering if your thought had changed or how that was being carried forward.
I think the thing about I think there's a kind of thing about design and how far you can go with design, and it's to do territory. I think is to do with the way that people occupy spaces, and I think that is to a large degree unpredictable, and should be, because when architects design for form to follow function, they usually get it wrong because they have a wrong conception of what the function is, and they've designed their spaces too specifically for that wrong conception of what a function is, and hence you get spaces that don't work. And I think in lots of ways we're very traditional. You know, the house layouts that we design are based upon traditional house plans that have worked for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. So you know that there's a sort of inherent flexibility, and that flexibility allows people to territorialize spaces. Like, so for example, I used the example of the teenager's bedroom, which is a way in which at a certain age somebody creates their own territory that has certain rules about it that you have to adhere to. Like if you're a parent, you're not allowed in, for example, and you know, certain a pal is allowed in under certain rules. But that's made by the occupant, and then you know maybe that family moves out, and another family moves in, and they've got very young children, and the room becomes a different kind of territory. So I think what we're trying to do is to identify that this idea of territory exists as a spatial conception, and to allow for it to happen, but not to prescribe how it happens, to allow people to occupy the spaces as they will. And like we said, you know, we imagined with the Manchester housing that people would decorate the houses in a particular way, and of course they didn't. Because we got that completely wrong. And it didn't matter because it's flexible enough for those people to live however they choose to live. It's just that they're not living how... they all go to IKEA now. Everybody goes to IKEA. There's a gentleman... Do you have a microphone, or is that something else you've got to do?
Yes, I have. Many of your operations involve tropes around the aesthetic agenda of suburban homes. Have you considered, or have you expanded into some of the operational or performative aspects of homes, heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, beyond the program, which you have addressed, or material aspects or constructional logics in terms of this kind of turning or troping suburban life?
Well, I think one of the... to talk about kind of construction, I think one of the currencies of architecture, contemporary architecture, is form, and that a lot of current contemporary architecture relies upon very expensive construction techniques. This building is an example, but fortunately this building probably had a very good budget because it's a well-funded arts organisation, so you can do that. Now, the buildings that we work on generally have to be built very inexpensively. So we tend to use very traditional construction techniques, and we use the addition of decoration and material, if you like, as surface treatment as a way to express the architecture. So in a sense, it works a little bit like a suburban house does, where you get what is in fact a very kind of cheap envelope, often a sort of balloon frame type thing with a particular kind of cladding on the outside or siding on it, and that, you know, people then come and add such and such a carpet or furniture like this, or little knickknacks they put all over the front, coach lamps and wagon wheels and so on. And so in a sense it does follow that logic. And what we it's quite interesting because we're often found in a situation where you have to cut budgets. And, you know, for example, at the moment in the UK, because of the activities of people in your financial system. Over here, we are suffering a downturn in our economy, and that has resulted in falling house prices, but at the same time there's a lot of work in the system, so construction costs are going up and values are falling, so the developers are being squeezed at both times, so you're often having to make changes. And I think the way that we design actually allows you to make changes without necessarily fundamentally compromising the concept. I don't know if that answers your question or I've gone off on one, but I think there's a sort of use of a certain technique that are derived to a degree. I mean, and not, like I said at the beginning, not everything we do is to do with suburbia, but I've placed a lot of emphasis on that because of the context of the exhibition. But allow certain performative operations that give you a certain amount of flexibility. And I think there's a very good example. A building by Zaha Hadid has just recently been cancelled in London partly because of the state of play in the economy. But you can't, once with the Zaha building, you say, actually, we've got $10 million or £10 million less than we had. The project's up shit creek, basically, because you can't change it. It relies totally on some incredibly sculptural concrete shell that is a sort of bespoke construction. And, we don't do that. Not because we wouldn't, but we've never had budgets to work with to do that kind of thing. I hope that answers your question. Or answers some of it, anyway. I think that might be it. Well, thank you once again.